Hey everyone, welcome back to JaRDev. Today I've got a fun little unboxing review video for you. Third Editions Publishing very kindly sent me my own copy of the Dark Souls book that they released. So I've got the package right down here. We're just going to unbox it quickly. Then I'm going to read it and I'll do like a little review, talk about it at the end. Alright, so we got the package here, just covering my address. Oh, there we go. So, I've got it still a little bit taped. Are we going to be able to get into it? Possibly not. Okay, got into it. So it's Dark Souls Beyond the Grave, which is all about Demon Souls, Dark Souls, and Dark Souls 2. It looks really, really nice. It's hardcover. It's got a little bookmark in it. It's really cold because it's just come out of the mailbox. But it looks fantastic. I'm so excited to read this. So yeah, thanks so much to Third Editions for just sending this to me. That's great. I'm going to read this on my trip to Japan, I think, and I'll do a little video talking about it afterwards. Maybe even from Japan. Ooh. Alright, so I finally finished reading the Dark Souls book. Took me a lot longer than I was expecting. Didn't get to read any in Japan. Whatever, you don't need excuses. Finished reading it. It was great. Long story short, if you like Dark Souls, you will absolutely love this book, pretty much. I'll go through, kind of talk about chapter by chapter, some of its strengths and weaknesses, but overall, positive review from me, thumbs up. Really impressed by it. So as of right now, it's not available to order on Amazon. I guess you can only get it from bookstores or from Third Editions Publishing themselves. $30 US. It's a really beautiful book. It's quality made. Got a really nice little bookmark in there. It's hardcover. $30 for a hardcover book. It's 287 pages. That seems pretty reasonable to me. I don't buy a lot of books anymore. I get ebooks. But I think that's a pretty decent deal. So there's 7 chapters in the book. The chapters are on the creative process, gameplay, universe, themes, music, decryption, and legacy. Chapter 3, the universe section, takes up about half the book. And obviously, it's the most interesting part of the book for me. It's all about the lore, characters, it's got theories. I won't spoil any of the theories because they're really, really cool. But there's some really, really unique ones in here. There's one about Dark Souls 2. No spoilers, but the theory, like kind of the main thing in the theory is that Vendrick from Dark Souls 2 may have been somewhere in Dark Souls 1. I don't know if it's the right theory, but it is really unique, and it's really cool to think about. So there's 2 prefaces in here. One of them is by VatiVidya, who does amazing Dark Souls videos. So that was like an instant positive for me, because I love his videos, so it was cool to kind of read some of his writing. And Vati does say that when he received his copy, he instantly flipped to chapter 3 just to look at the universe chapter. Which is fair, it is like the main selling point of the book, but having the first 2 chapters in there is really good. We'll kind of go over those, but it's good to have kind of a base to build the 3rd chapter off of. I will say that, like, this book, it's Dark Souls Beyond the Grave. It's about Demon Souls, Dark Souls, and Dark Souls 2. So having never played any Demon Souls, I played 15 minutes of it before, I think. Just having played that, having no knowledge of Demon Souls really, the chapters and parts on Demon Souls were kind of dull to me. I found it really hard to follow any of the lore stuff. And they just didn't really capture my imagination that much. Having said that, reading this book is actually what inspired me to start playing Demon Souls, which I'm currently in the middle of playing, and it's really fun. And I'm kind of appreciating parts of the lore and some of the dialogue in the game. So it was hard to get through the Demon Souls stuff without having played it. But still kind of interesting. Once you kind of work out the characters, it kind of works. Like it gives a brief overview of Demon Souls, but it definitely relies on players having played Demon Souls before. So that is something to bear in mind. If you haven't played any Dark Souls, this will probably be a bit of a tough read, especially all the lore stuff, but because I'm very familiar with Dark Souls 1 and Dark Souls 2 lore, so it was just great to read for me. Even if you like just played the games and haven't looked into the lore, you should still be able to follow the lore, the universe chapter. Okay, so the first chapter is the creative process, which is really, really interesting. It's kind of the backstory behind the creators, Hidetaka Miyazaki, and also how From Software came to be, all the games they made before Demon's Souls, like the King's Gate series and the Armored Core series. That was really interesting to read about and learn about. You learn all kinds of really cool things in the creative process chapter. Like a super fun fact was that Dark Souls 1, the soundtrack was recorded with a real live orchestra, and Dark Souls 2 was just all made by one guy on a computer, the soundtrack for it. So that was just a cool little fact that you found out. So chapter 1, really interesting. Now chapter 2 is a bit of a weird chapter. It's pretty questionable to have it in here, to be honest. It's the gameplay chapter. It basically just talks about how the games are played, like all game mechanics and stuff, like how blocking works and how fast travel works and stuff, which, since this book relies pretty heavily on people having played the games before or watched the games, it seems like you really didn't need the whole chapter. It was pretty boring to read this chapter. Having played a lot of Souls, didn't really need to learn about encounters with bosses, for example. So I guess that chapter's kind of in there for people who haven't played the games, but honestly, if you haven't played the games, you're going to struggle with the rest of the book, so it doesn't really seem that necessary to have that chapter in there. And then chapter 3, the best chapter in the book. It starts with a little introduction to the chapter, kind of dispelling the belief that Dark Souls doesn't have a story. It talks about how all the Souls games are fairly similar. Like it talks about the similarities between Demon's Souls and Dark Souls 2. Like the concept of time is repeated quite a lot between the games. Then once we're done that, we go into the segment on Demon's Souls, which starts with a backstory, basically breaks down the opening cinematic. Then it gives kind of like a timeline of the Demon's Souls games and the universe, which is probably one of the most interesting parts. It drops a lot of names in this part though, so it's quite hard to keep track of. But if you've watched Demon's Souls, if you've played Demon's Souls, you should be able to follow it pretty well. And then once it's gone through the main story, it talks about locations in the game and also the most important characters. And that part actually makes up most of the Demon's Souls segment. The same's true for the Dark Souls and Dark Souls 2 segments. It'll do a little intro to the game, it'll talk about the overarching story, and then it'll talk about locations and characters. And I've watched a ton of videos on Dark Souls lore and Dark Souls 2 lore, and I always kind of mostly got it. Watching Vati's videos really helped, but there were some parts that I didn't super get, like Age of Gods, Age of Fire in Dark Souls 1, Age of Dark. Didn't totally get what they meant. After reading this book, I understand them perfectly now. I'm not going to talk about them in here. Read the book, it'll be good. But this book definitely made it easier to understand a lot of the really complex parts of Dark Souls lore. So once we're done chapter 3, we go into the chapter on themes, which is really cool. It gives a lot of the background and influences of the Souls series. So it talks about like what mythologies inspired Dark Souls, all these ideas that pop up again and again in the games, like time that I mentioned before. Then we have a whole chapter on music, which was also really interesting. The author does tend to disparage the Dark Souls 2 soundtrack a bit, and I really like the Dark Souls 2 soundtrack. It doesn't sound as impressive, especially once you do learn that it was all recorded on a computer instead of being with a live orchestra. That also makes you just really appreciate the Dark Souls 1 soundtrack. And then we get to another fairly questionable chapter. It's chapter 6, Decryption, which doesn't really mean anything. It goes a little bit rambly in this chapter. The author does talk for about 2 pages straight, just about horror games and Resident Evil in particular. They make a lot of very questionable comparisons, like Dark Souls is a true survival horror game. I can kind of see it, but I wouldn't classify it as survival horror. He talks about Resident Evil a lot. He makes a lot of weird references. like Soul Calibur. I don't think there was ever an intentional reference to Soul Calibur, I could be wrong. And then we come to the final chapter, which is Legacy, which kind of talks about what the Souls series has in turn inspired itself. Like what games have been inspired by the Souls series. So all in all, very positive review, 2 thumbs up, whatever you want. I really enjoyed it, absolutely loved reading it. Dark Souls is my absolute favorite game series of all time though. Dark Souls 3 is my favorite game ever. I hope they do a part 2 of the Beyond the Grave series. I'd love to read about Dark Souls 3 and also Bloodborne, because I don't have too much idea of Bloodborne. So hopefully they're making a part 2. But if you're struggling to understand Dark Souls lore and you're interested in it, this is just the best way to get it all right in front of you. You could watch every single one of Vati's videos, which I think I've done. I've watched pretty much all of them. And I still didn't quite get all the lore. This book, you know, the chapter, it's a long-ass chapter. It takes a long time to read it, but it's so worth it and it was so interesting to me. So I heartily recommend Dark Souls Beyond the Grave. Thank you guys very much for watching. Make sure you leave a like and subscribe if you enjoyed this. Go check the book out. I don't get anything if you buy the book. Just, I'm a fan of it and I like to recommend it. And I'll see you guys later. Bye.